Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome to today's program. For those of you joining on the Zoom webinar, you probably know this, but we tell everybody each time just so that you're comfortable and aware. We can't see or hear the audience. We also cannot call on any raised hands, but the Q&A feature is enabled through Zoom, and that is how we would love to bring you into this conversation as we go. So post questions at any time, and we will note them and hopefully bring many of them into the dialogue. For those of you joining on YouTube, we are delighted to have you either watching us live now or perhaps catching this program at a time that's more convenient for you. We're not able to moderate Q&A through YouTube and wanted to make you aware of that. So before we get started today, I just want to invite you to attend some of our upcoming events. I will be back on the air tomorrow, that's February the 24th, with a program delivered by Associate Professor Alexis Duncan on understanding eating disorders, insight from epidemiology. And then next week we have 4 programs. So something for you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But I'll just share that on Monday, that's February the 28th, we're doing a program that I think many of the same folks that are interested in this topic might be interested in, and that's on community and policy practice during a pandemic, increasing incivility and misinformation. So perhaps some of the same themes or perhaps some of the same practice context. That program is going to be offered in partnership with Influencing Social Policy and the Association for Community Organization and Social Action. Excited to be working with them. But now to get us started on today's curriculum showcase event, I'd like to invite Associate Director of Admissions and Recruitment, Sarah Birch, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Janet, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. We were just talking earlier about how these programs have been able to reach so many folks across not only the nation, but the world. And so we are truly grateful that you're here. And a very special welcome to our prospective students who are joining us for this series called Curriculum Showcase, where you'll get a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be in the classroom with some of our wonderful and esteemed colleagues and faculty here at the Brown School. Please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know if you're a prospective student, if you've been admitted and you're thinking about joining us this fall. We'd love to hear from you. And I will turn it back to Janet to introduce our moderator and speakers.
Well, next up is going to be Dan Ferris, who oversees many of the policy-related initiatives here at the school, including our MSP degree program. Dan, take us away.
Thank you so much, Janet and Sarah. I'm Dan Ferris. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Assistant Dean for Policy Initiatives for the MSP, the Master of Social Policy program at the Brown School, and I lead training and education initiatives for the Social Policy Institute. It is my absolute privilege and honor to welcome everyone and introduce 2 amazing colleagues who, through their work, lead incredible programming, courses and curriculum, research and community building around policy and racial equity at the Brown School, St. Louis, and beyond. So Jewel Stafford is our Assistant Dean for Field Education at the Brown School, and Atia Thurman is a lecturer with the Brown School. So to say Jewel and Atia have been instrumental in my own learning and commitment to understanding and advancing racial equity through policy practice and research would be one heck of an understatement. And I'm sure many in attendance today who know them are agreeing and nodding right along. So they lead through their work in the field and in preparing the next generation of emerging policy leaders, whether challenging the idea of unanticipated or unintended consequences, or providing meaningful, applicable frameworks and tools for us to advance in our work together. I've gained so much personally and professionally from our presenters, and I'm thrilled to be truly opening the classroom together today as we share the space for their presentation and following discussion. So please join me wherever and however you are participating from today in thanking and welcoming Jewel and Atia.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Dan. We appreciate it, and it is mutual. And thank you for everyone who is here today. Before we get started, or as we get started, there's one thing we'd like to do. We're going to do a land acknowledgement. And before that, though, one thing I'd ask for you as an audience is you're going to spend time with us today, and your time is valuable. I'd love to see you take a moment, take a deep breath, and set an intention of what you, of listening, of learning, of being open-minded, and of listening for something that you can take away that'll be useful in the work that you're doing. I do want to acknowledge that many of us who are in the St. Louis region, we are in the ancestral homelands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, and Illini Confederacy, and many other tribes that have resided here, occupied, and call this region home. We honor them and thank them for the stewardship of this land. We also want to acknowledge that many Native and Indigenous people who continue to live each day come from a long line who were removed unjustly from these lands. Thank you, and we'll get started. Today, you joined us for racial equity lens. We're using the racial equity lens in policymaking. And you might want to ask yourself, why race? Why equity? Many of you may have answers to this, and we want you to think about this. Race is at the center of a global caste system. Since before the founding of our country, a socially constructed racial hierarchy has been used to justify the erasure, the enslavement, and the exploitation of entire groups of human beings, including Native and Indigenous Americans, people of African descent, Asian descent, Latinx descent, and even European descent. This same racial hierarchy has produced a system of white privilege and power so deeply embedded in every aspect of our society. Oftentimes, we navigate through it unbeknownst to us, or we're not aware of it. It's almost become an immunity, right? Despite being a social construct, race is one of the most profound and greatest predictors of an individual's life experience, as well as population level outcomes. The evidence is now, it's undeniable, right? We've come to a vast nationwide awakening that racial disparities are well documented, demonstrated, and exist for every dimension of life from cradle to grave. So my next question is for my colleague, Jewel. Why equity?
So thank you for that. The reason why we are looking at equity is based off of all of the constructs that Atia just spoke about. And so if we think through the racial construction, if we think through gender construction, if we think through all of the isms, we have about a 400-year disadvantage. And so when we think about equality, we're thinking that everyone is starting off on a level playing field, and that's just not true. And so what equality does is make the assumption that we all have access to the same resources and availability to the same quality resources. And what equity is letting us know is acknowledging that there are some outcomes that need to be measured regardless of race. And so how do we account for the 400, the 200, the 100 years of disadvantages that have been constructed by race or gender? And equity says we will no longer look at equality. We will look for fair treatment. We will increase the access and only expect excellence for the availability of resources at a bare minimum for all of the constructs that have been suffering disproportionately from the burdens of inequalities and inequities in the past. And so we move on to racism. So racism is a belief that fundamentally thinks through these attitudes that reflects or fosters beliefs of superiority of a particular race. But really what we want to engage you in a conversation about is we can't discuss racial equity without first talking about racism. And until recently, our nation has not widely accepted or acknowledged systemic racism. And so we want to highlight that for you, that systemic racism is an oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. And what this means is that the burden of proof falls on those who have the lived experience to demonstrate that this exists. And so our efforts are to pull out the invisible and make it invisible, pull out the invisible and make it visible. So how can we increase our efforts to make racism visible and without being met with levels of violence, doubt, stereotypes and tropes, right? How do we do that in a conversation that calls you into dialogue so we can address how these gaps are impacting communities who really just want to enhance their well-being and be a part of the world that we see today?
So institutionalized racism identifies dimensions of our culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with non-whiteness to endure and evolve over time. Systemic racism is not something that a few people, a few bad actors, or institutions practice. Systemic racism it's been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems of our entire nation. So even when we remove racist actors or specific racist behaviors, and we may think they're long gone and we know that they're not, but even when we remove that from the equation, this system continues to produce racial disparities because it has been designed that way. I just want you to take a look at the pillars around ideology, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, institutions that have these unspoken, both formal and informal norms that are practiced, and then policy and law, which essentially enshrines racism. And so then even when we remove maybe the original intention, the original engineers and architects of these racist policies, we still have the same outcomes because the structure is there and it's designed that way.
I do this in class as well. So when we're thinking about racial equity, what we're really thinking about are, like Atia just said, looking at those outcomes. And if we don't like the outcomes that we're seeing, then we need to look at the process. And so the process of looking through racial equity as a concept is examining the root causes, intentionally changing those policies, those practices, those systems and structures that eliminate racial disparities, right? How are we thinking about disrupting and redesigning systems that are designed to do exactly what they're designed to do? So I know we talk a lot about how to do that, and we're going to look through developing a racial equity lens. But racial equity is also an outcome that individuals are not likely to experience greater burden or benefit because of their race. Those outcomes are no longer predicted by race. What would that look like? How would that feel? How would it look like when all things, when considered, are just no longer judged by the racial construct? Well, that's equity. Just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And we really want to unlock the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in all of us in this great diverse tapestry of life.
We talk a lot about a racial equity lens, and this is a little bit about what does the lens do? How does it function? Because if we're not consciously addressing racial equity, we are often subconsciously replicating racism. And while most policies may appear neutral, often they are not, and they have negative or positive racialized impacts. So the racial equity lens allows us to uncover the structures, policies, and behaviors that sustain disparate outcomes. That includes centering race and racism explicitly. It doesn't mean at the exclusion of anything else, but we need to be explicit about centering race and racism. We need to be proactive about illuminating racial disparities and examining the root causes, just as Jules said. Challenging the status quo and dominant norms, and recognizing characters of white supremacy culture. And embracing radical inclusion of stakeholders, especially those who are most disadvantaged or have been marginalized historically. And adopting clear and specific goals. Let's use the SMART. A lot of people know what SMART is, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Let's make clear about our goals, objectives, our measurable outcomes to advance racial equity. and then let's evaluate them consistently.
So we've talked a lot about definitions, but let's also start thinking about some case studies that we can wrap our heads around, right? And so how is this operationalized in our worlds? What examples do we see? So today we wanted to examine the US criminal justice system. And so really thinking through the time of slavery, right? Since slavery, the US legal and justice system have been used to sanction racial discrimination and oppression. And this systemic racism is evident at every stage of the system, from policing to prosecutorial decisions, pretrial release processes, sentencing, correctional discipline, and even reentry. So what
According
does
to
that
the,
So what does that mean?
So what that looks like is just a quick snapshot. We're going to feed you some data, right? Since we're and some evidence around this. Is the criminal justice system it's been a place where we've been able to be really clear and really undeniable about where we observe, how and where we can measure and observe racial inequity. So according to the Vera Institute of Justice, the U.S. incarcerates more people than any country in the world, and people of color are incarcerated at a rate that is much unmistakably higher and disproportionate. And again, this is like what Joel said, it's a lot to do with a criminal justice system that's held together by policies and practices, both formal and informal, that influence the degree to which an individual will interact with the system. This is by design, because if you think about the legal system and the justice system from the beginning has been used to enslave, to take land, to steal labor, to steal lives. It's been validated and justified through our legal system. It has been in place for longer than our country has, in order to subjugate, in order to for the means of one group over another. So we've used the legal system and policies as a way to enshrine power of one group over another. And so at multiple points, race is likely to play a role, and disparities mount as individuals progress through the system. So I love this quote. It's not my quote, but it says, like an avalanche, racial disparity grows cumulatively as people traverse the criminal justice system. African-American citizens are more, and it starts with school discipline. Okay, so from school discipline all the way through the incarceration system into reentry. African-American citizens are overall more likely to be stopped by police, arrested, detained before trial, and given harsher sentences than white people. The effects of high rates of incarceration have broad consequences for offenders in the community, and challenges around reentry with gaining employment, reduced lifetime earnings, denial of access to public benefits, disenfranchisement when they've served their time but can no longer vote, and then families and children. It just creates a generational effect around the financial loss, the emotional distress, and the greater likelihood of being involved with the justice system. So I want you to imagine being pushed into this avalanche from K through 12, right before that, with racial disparities in school discipline. And next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, because this is where the slippery slope starts. As young as a kindergartner, right? The use of out-of-school suspensions are much higher, much higher for Black male children. And this is across the nation and cannot be explained just by behavior or by infraction. So there is a mountain of evidence around the fact that racial discrimination and bias is built within this system. Researchers from the Brown School and Forward through Ferguson investigated how race, sex, and disability came together to affect the risk for out-of-school suspension for K through 12 students in the St. Louis region. So those of us who are familiar with the St. Louis region, this study was done a couple of years ago, and they found that being Black, male, and having a disability places a student at greater risk, sometimes up to 60% greater risk than a white female student. And the consequences are negative, and they impact the student through their lifetime. It affects high school graduation level, expulsion, likely to graduate from college, to be arrested as a minor, to be convicted, and to go to prison.
So what we're thinking about as we call you into this conversation is to look through our system through a racial equity lens and understand that the construct of race offers an opportunity to understand why we see the statistics that we do. So often we hear these statistics and we think that it's probably on an individual level or we think it's on a group level. But what we're understanding is that policies open doors. They create the guardrails by which doors are open for some and closed for others. And so now what we are asking you to do as our community partners, as our thought partners, is to get a little curious when you see these statistics, as opposed to critical. There's a lot of victim blaming that happens, and what we want to offer you is that the system is designed to do what it's doing. And so the outcomes that we're seeing are not by circumstance, they are by design. And so what we want you to see is that it's not just our Black brothers and sisters, but our American Indian brothers and sisters, our Hispanic and Latinx brothers and sisters that are also part of our Brown and Black communities that are disproportionately impacted by policies around offenses, right? So what is that saying to us? How are we engaging with a system that's designed to protect us and instead socially controls our bodies? How do we continue to perpetuate racism and inequities without looking at things through a racial equity lens? And that's what we're offering and that's what we're submitting for your consideration today, is that people who are having contact with police, people of color, are disproportionately experiencing use of force. There's a dehumanization that is integrated into how people think about people of color. And so is that in the training? Is that in the programming? Is that in the policies? Where do we need to start looking? Because again, if we don't like the outcomes, we have to start examining the processes. And so Black and Native Americans are more likely to be killed by law enforcement than any other racial or ethnic groups. And experts believe that stigma and racism may play a major role in police community interactions. Additionally, although whites account for 76% of the US population, Black people make up 13%, Hispanic and Latinos, which include people of any race, make up about 18%. And yet 1 in 3 Black men, 1 in 3 Black men and 1 in 6 Latinx men will have or likely face imprisonment in their lifetime. That is not a group statistic, that is a political statement. And what we're asking people to think about is, how do we want to engage with the systems that are designed to protect and serve us when our outcomes are showing that they're actually hurting and harming our communities of color?
Remember we talked about one of the things when you use a racial equity lens to understand the root causes. So I want to take you back to some of the root causes around what we may be seeing as all this disproportionate interaction with policing and with over-incarceration in America. In the 70s, President Nixon launched the war on drugs, setting into motion several decades of tough on crime policies, which have led to more individuals who commit less serious crimes spending longer sentences in jail. However, this was not just about drugs. This was really a policy that targeted Black people. And we have this famous quote from one of his aides who was critical, who helped to create this policy, where he actually confesses and says, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That was John Ehrlichman, and who later on went to serve 18 months in prison for his role in Watergate. So just to give you an example, in 1986, there was a drug law that mandated harsher punishments for crack cocaine possession than powder cocaine, even though They're from the same drug. They're two versions of the same drug. Crack cocaine was more popular amongst Black and brown communities. White powder cocaine was more popular among white populations. If you had 5 grams of crack, you served 5 years. You had to have 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. So more than 4 decades later, and over $1 trillion, and the human cost I can't even begin to try to quantify, but the war on drugs has played a significant role in the US being the leader in incarceration and disproportionately incarcerating Black and brown men and women. And despite the same rate of drug use, a Black person is nearly 4 times more likely than their white counterpart to be arrested for drug offenses, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession. And I want you to hear this, 12 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of drug-related crimes. So the war on drugs led to African-American citizens being the most imprisoned group of people in the United States. This was an already severely disenfranchised group. We were coming out of like Jim Crow, right? And going right into a new way of controlling and overpowering the Black community through drug laws and the legal system. And so while these policies have been just very, very costly and grossly ineffective, they have been extremely effective at devastating Black families and communities. And Michelle Alexander is renowned for documenting this and being an advocate. She's a civil rights lawyer, an advocate, a legal scholar, and the author of the best-selling and influential book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness.
So I remember growing up in the war on drugs. I was talking to Atia about this, about being a dare kid and having Nancy Reagan come out and tell us to just say no. And so with the crack epidemic, we looked at it as a moral failing. We looked at it as though people could control their actions. And with the opioid epidemic, we understood that addiction is a disease. We shared more compassion. We offered more frontline training. We engaged our frontline EMTs, police officers, and everyone else on the front lines with Narcan, right? So we started to look conversely at the opioid epidemic as a public health crisis. Look at the narratives that were around that, right? So when one group of people are experiencing addiction, it's a moral failing. When the opioid epidemic in particular has penetrated the white middle class, now we have a public health crisis. And collectively, our nation has decided on a more empathetic and less punitive response, emphasizing treatment over punishment. And despite the more compassionate view of drug addiction today, racial inequities still exist within drug arrest and sentencing. And so we want to conceptualize addiction and all of the avalanche systems that Atia was referring to as points of rehabilitation and treatment, right? What if we use that as an intervention point as opposed to a punishment point, right? What if we use that as an opportunity to help and elevate people into understanding why the trauma they've been experiencing would lead them to engage in the war on drugs or in drug use, as opposed to holding it as a moral failing.
But if your goal was to minimize access, was to devastate communities, was to punish and to enslave in a different way, if that was the goal, then it was successful.
And so by evidence of the outcomes, because we are an outcome-based school, I would say, Atia, that it was successful by that measure. And so what do we think about disrupting, dismantling, and reshaping a society that is founded on systemic racism and harm? Well, it requires us to center equity. It requires us to think about equity and this 400-year disadvantage that some communities have been suffering through. And so integrating racial equity into policymaking means a more productive and inclusive democracy. So the question we have is, how Are we thinking about our current processes? And are our current processes enough to center equity? And if so, where do we start, right? So if our current processes are not reflecting equity, where do we start? So I'm going to give it back to my friend Atia.
We're going to start with a set of principles. Let's be clear, our founding principles are a great place to start. And our country has not demonstrated exactly, it's not been as committed to its founding principles in action. And the evidence, so it's been a long evolution to actually extend those founding principles and guiding principles to all humans in this country. And we're still not there, but we're on the way there. So Race Forward is a nonprofit racial justice organization, and they have proposed a set of principles for racially equitable policy platform. And this was developed not just by them, it's in collaboration with the People's Action, the National Congress of American Indians, Policy Link, National Urban League, Demos, so many, the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. And so the first in the set of principles is fix systems, not people. We understand that policies now, we have full understanding that policies and institutions are at the root of inequity, so that they're also key to creating policy that allows all people to live healthy lives. This looks like affordable housing, high quality childcare and K-12 education, health for all, a just immigration system, and so much more. Principle number 2, create racially equitable solutions that benefit, well, that's okay. We'll fix that one. But this one is about the curb cut effect. Some of you may have heard of the curb cut effect. It goes way back to when the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991 created curb cuts in sidewalks so that people in a wheelchair could have access, right? And this then created this phenomenon of benefiting all people, right? All of a sudden, people with strollers and carts, joggers, and the elderly. And we realized something that benefited one marginalized group now benefited all of us. And the third principle is about inclusive engagement. That includes communities and leaders from the most impacted populations. We just can't do this work if we aren't more inclusive, and we don't make a bigger table for more people to sit at it in decision making. Principle number 4 is about tracking and disaggregating data. This is, again, we can be race explicit without being exclusive. So data should be collected across racial, ethnic, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, immigration status, and more. And then finally, this principle is about proposing solutions that will directly impact people of color and other oppressed communities so that we can proactively consider unintended and unanticipated consequences. So I'm not going to give a pass. There are plenty of policies that are having the intended consequences that they were meant to. Case in point is our legal justice system. However, we also operate oftentimes in ways that, again, we try to look at things as being racially neutral, and they're not. So we really do need to go through a process that helps us to understand and then set measurable to counter. We're at a place where 400 years later, the aim cannot be equality. We need equity to get us to equality. So we have to be more intentional than ever.
So one effective tool that has been helpful for all of us since, and we've seen this as evidence through the civil rights movement, is having federal policies to help us move beyond this cadence of equality and we'll catch up eventually. And so this executive order understands that there are entrenched disparities in our laws and our public policies, and it doesn't shy away from that. It even includes our public and our private institutions that have denied equal opportunity to individuals and communities. And so because equity requires a systematic approach to the embedding of fairness in decision-making, we now have an executive order from President Biden that was enacted in January 20th, 2021. And so what does this look like? So much of the conversation is what it is, But how do we do it? How do we make this change?
One of the tools we'd like to highlight here, because this is a long process, this is a long journey. We may not see the outcomes from this process of advancing racial equity for another 250 years. We know that it's going to be another 200 years before families of color even have wealth parity with white families. So this is going to take a while, but let's start somewhere. And here's one tool: racial equity impact statements. Now, I want you to hear me out. This is not a new tool. Equity impact statements have been around at least since the 1969 with the environmental impact statements that it was required by the National Environmental Policy Act. So we have several decades of using impact statements and impact assessments. These are a decision-making tool. They help us to make a decision about where to lay a highway, right? How to counter an environmental impact when we're creating new infrastructure. So here it describes the positive and negative effects of a proposed action, right? And so a racial equity impact statement is very similar to that. It's a systemic examination of how different racial and ethnic groups will likely be affected by a proposed action or a decision. And it also requires us to mitigate to anticipate and mitigate possible adverse consequences. So the use of a racial equity impact assessment is fairly new to the United States. The United Kingdom has been using them with success since about the year 2000. But it's exciting to think that we have a tool in place, we have a system in place already that we can then adopt for racial equity.
So why? Why use a racial equity impact assessment? Well, they're particularly important for criminal justice activity and criminal justice policy because it is exceedingly difficult to reverse sentencing policies once they've been adopted. So we live in a region now where in one state, at least, right, marijuana has been decriminalized. And did we associate or did we link the liberation policies or reconcile the policies for those that were sentenced under the previous policies, right, around marijuana grams and usage once we decriminalize marijuana? Chances are we're still in the process of engaging in that liberation process, right? And so what does that look like? So Iowa, right, they had their first racial impact legislation, and it's the first one in the United States. And although, right, the data on disparities has shown a slight decrease from the Black to white ratio of incarceration over a 9 period of time, it's not saying that it is the panacea, right? It's not saying that it's the one-stop shopping. But what it does demonstrate for us is that using a racial equity lens allows us to see what was invisible before we started using the lens. So it pulls a lot of those constructs out. And while the drop in disparities can't be directly attributed, what we can say is that if we continue to peel back the layers, we're getting closer and closer to the outcomes we actually want to see. So this is a tool that helps to educate decision makers about disparities, especially for those that really don't believe that they exist. This is an opportunity tool to get you to start thinking about how to avoid and minimize adverse impacts and those unintended consequences on the people that are disproportionately impacted by a phenomenon. Oh, I get to talk. And so there's more about how we do this. So if you've noticed, I've been explicitly asking questions because by nature, this work requires me to be curious and not critical. And so Race Forward offers a set of questions to anticipate, assess, prevent, and think through potential adverse consequences. So what are the intended consequences, but then what are the unanticipated consequences of a proposed action on different racial groups? And so Race Forward was one of the first organizations to introduce this tool in the United States. And it's really a set of questions to designed to guide your decision making. So this is how we do it. Right? So what kind of questions? So Question 2 refers to engaging stakeholders. So have the stakeholders from different racial and ethnic groups, especially those of diverse backgrounds that are disproportionately impacted, have they been informed, meaningfully involved, and authentically represented in the development of this proposal? And who is missing from the table? Who has seats at the table? And if those members that aren't represented by that particular phenomenon are not at the table, how do we engage them? How can we include them as part of the decision-making process? So again, it's really asking questions. And sometimes it's good to think through these things on an agenda, right? So at the beginning of your agenda at your meetings, asking those really explicit questions: who's missing and how can they be engaged?
Yeah, and I want to go back to that just for a second, Joel, and talk about this is where local policy and local decision-making has a huge impact. So I know the case study we gave you was, looking at federal policy around drugs and imprisonment, incarceration, and actually part of that federal policy helped to militarize local police. And so we also saw some really egregious effects. Most of the incarceration problem happens at the state level, honestly. So this is to give you a sense of local power is very, very powerful. But that means that in solution making, local power is just as powerful, right? And this is a great example. Like if you're working with a local population and you're making proposed actions, say around the unhoused, right? Locally, you're going to have the most impact around the unhoused. They are right there in your proximity. How is their voice showing up in proposed actions? What data do you have about them? I know it's harder and harder to get data on certain groups, right? And we know transient groups are really hard sometimes to assess and get and even invite them in part of the process. But if you're working at a very local level, this is where you have probably the most impact on individuals and people's lives, is at this local level. Federal policy is extremely powerful. State policy is extremely powerful and dictates so much of how we operate locally. But our solution building locally can just be phenomenal in redressing all kinds of issues, particularly racism. So think about it. If you're working with certain populations, youth, families, who have been maybe historically disenfranchised, marginalized, and not at the table, how can you get them to the table? And what do you need to know from them? You'd be surprised how impactful it is to engage your impacted audiences in the solution making. And I would say that most of the time we can't do it anymore without them. We want to give you an example of maybe what it looks like to center racial equity in policy. What would it look like if equity were the starting point for policy making? And what if policy reform centered on the most impacted population, the populations that bear the greatest inequity, injustice, and undue impact of certain policies? What if their safety and health matter just as much as anyone? So the Race and Opportunity Lab at Washington University at the Brown School and the Center for Social Development, they proposed this exact thing in a series of policy briefs, and then later on in some community initiatives. They said, what if we actually looked at the safety of Black boys and young men, since this is who is experiencing out of school suspensions, and this is who is experiencing so much racial discrimination in the legal justice system. What if we actually centered their safety first? And it would look like at a state level, things like banning the use of chokeholds and strangleholds, establishing use of a database, and allowing public release of police misconduct reports, mandating external and independent investigation, and requiring that police departments bear the cost of misconduct. This is a phenomenal way of looking at things, right? It spins it on its head. Right now, there's so much injustice happening around the world. I think about missing and murdered Indigenous women. I think about immigrant families being separated at the border. I think about Haitian refugees. I'm thinking about so many different groups. And I'm thinking about the policies that have created barriers for them. So sometimes there's a rhetoric, right? A lot of you have seen the diagram, right? All the different visuals that surface the internet around equity versus equality. In equality, we see people standing at a game at a fence. First and foremost, I have a very hard time with this because why are they outside the game? This is exactly indicative of our country, right? There's a barrier between them even having access. They have to watch the game from a fence. They're not even invited. They don't have access. There are barriers to access. Okay. And then we have this rhetoric around, we're going to give them stools to stand on to make it so that all of them can see equally at the same height. We're not giving anyone anything. We have taken away for years and years and years. Okay. We have taken away, we have, stolen labor, stolen land, stolen lives. We're not giving anyone anything. We're taking away the barriers that were put in place intentionally. I want you to think about that. Okay. And I want you to think about when we're reforming policy, we need to think the exact opposite way of what we've been thinking. We need to center the groups and the people who have suffered the oppression from this, who have been ignored, who have been left out, whose lives have been, from all intents and purposes, we have actually said your life does not matter. This is where we need to start. Our entire country depends on this, right? So if you're part of a group of people who don't want to hear the word equity anymore, who think we are in a post-racial America, they're all around us. I know, and I don't know. I've struggled with those conversations. I'm gonna be really honest with you. I struggle with the fact that we're in a cycle of reckoning where some folks can't even see how those outcomes diminish our entire country. They jeopardize democracy. They take away from our ability to be a thriving nation. When we have people who struggling with healthcare, with access to food, with access to work, and they want to work, this isn't the place that our founders meant us to be. Maybe, I don't know the founders. They wrote some beautiful words that we're having a hard time operationalizing, right? 250 years later, right? But if you're struggling with people who don't see the generational and societal harm that comes from oppression and exploitation, because they're still caught up in a cycle of, in order for one group to benefit, the rest have to be put down. I'm not sure how to move that ideology and rhetoric. I struggle with that. That's a great question to ask, to say, like, we've got a set of people who are like, I don't want to talk about equity anymore. You know what? I don't know what to say, because racism has been here more than 400 years. So we need 400 years of equity, right? We need 400 years of, if you want to talk to them, don't say equity, say fair and just. Please remind them that the Constitution says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Take each line of that and help them understand, where injustice continues to exist, we will not be a just nation. Where domestic tranquility does not exist, where there is agitation, where there is oppression, if we are not looking out for the general welfare, and that is inclusive, that is vastly inclusive now, right? If we are failing families, and I don't just mean Black families and brown families, if we have policies that are failing working families, then we are not upholding our constitutional ideals or promises. So if you have someone that doesn't want to talk about equity, let's not talk about equity. Break out the Constitution.
And let's talk about policy. And let's talk about how we can engage people who are here in the conversation. And so what I appreciate so much about this is that it is our country, and we are here, and we all came through this beautiful land through imagination. And so what would it look like to reimagine what we want this world to be? And that if it indeed is something that we want to see as part of our future, can we imagine a healed and liberated future? Can we imagine a world where people have access and availability to the resources because they need them? So one really important researcher says that racism is inaction in the face of need. So if you don't want to talk about equity, like Atia was talking about, how are you producing inaction in the face of someone's need? And if you are calling yourself part of the helping profession, which is what we've ascribed to do here as social workers, public health professionals, and social policy professionals, then we engage in action regardless of need. And that is what equity is really helping us to think through. So I'm going to push us through the next couple of slides. But did you want to continue on this one, Atia?
Well, we had a great question. I mean, like a great question about, I want to thank people for the questions. I want to thank them for their comments. So yeah. There's a question about like, yeah, there's a lot of pushback. Like we had this reckoning, this cycle of reckoning that came out of 2020 with George Floyd, and how quickly we saw the pushback from that reckoning, right? Reckoning and truth telling is, you know, it agitates and it makes us want to change things. And we saw this incredible backlash from that. So right now we're seeing it play out in the education system. People don't want CRT in the schools. You know what? You don't have to have critical race theory in the school. You do have to tell the truth about this nation and its history. Our children need to understand how their lives now are impacted by an entire series of historical policies and outcomes, right? How in the world do I talk to Native and Indigenous children in my classroom without talking about our history of genocide, right? And it's not about discomfort levels. It's about we're preparing a next generation of Americans to form our more perfect union, right? So we do need to use data. We do need to use policies. We showed you a lot of data today, and we had so much we didn't even show you. We took out so many slides. There's just no time. Use the data. Make the argument that a broken system is broken for everyone. And we saw that. You know, we saw under Trump, the first act passed into policy, the First Step Act passed into policy almost unanimously, right? Full support from both sides of the aisle, because everyone said, whoa, 50 years later, and we're realizing this entire system is creating, there's so many repercussions, right? So I hate to say this, but even if you didn't center or care about the Black and Brown people who were serving all these sentences, you saw an entire system that was debilitating our economic system and putting us as the #1 in the lead for incarceration in the world. Everyone said something's got to change. So we do have to use data and policy and the systemic approach. But when the system is turning out inequity and disparity, chances are, if you look hard enough, you will see how it affects everybody. That's what I want to challenge you with, right? So we want to end today. Like, we didn't get to a lot of questions, but we had some very thoughtful questions. I want to say thank you, Jennifer, for talking about how health statistics, when we compare them to other countries, is one way of using data to show how when something is a system is inequitable, it hurts everyone. It harms everyone. So thank you for that. So I think we're almost out of time.
Atia and Jewel, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. And we have a couple of minutes, and we've been keeping track of a few of the questions that have come in the background, to be sure. So you can focus on the content and the presentation. So one thing that stood out that came through was from a slide. It said, like an avalanche, racial disparity grows cumulatively as people traverse the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Using that same metaphor, can racial equity also grow cumulatively?
Wow, this is what I mean. Imagine a healed future where we can actually start in a place, and can we have it grow, like just take off? I would love for someone in the audience or my colleague to think about, is there an example where we're seeing this happen? Keep in mind that the term racial equity is fairly new to the US lexicon. The concept of it may have looked like fairness and justice somewhere else. So I think we probably have examples in humanity.
Yeah.
But I love that concept of like, could the positive impacts also grow at an exponential rate? I hope so.
I hope so. And that's why we're in this business, right? To reverse and to grow the positive aspects, to be compassion, to be the change we want to see in the world, to invoke this need of, again, invoke action in the face of need. And we've seen it honestly during COVID. We've been able to accomplish so much with each other in communities when we were all just like thinking through how to piece some of these really important components together. So I'm excited about that. I'm going to ask.
I have an example. I think, okay, so one example is the research, and you can look right here in the St. Louis region. If you're from St. Louis, this is happening in just incredible ways between like an entire group of people, entire collaboration, but start looking at We Power. Look at early education, high quality early childhood education. This is a place where we could possibly see exponential growth in terms of closing racial disparities and advancing racial equity. When you invest in young people as early as 0 to 3, it has incredible lifelong impacts. We have been able to document this with evidence. Please check out some of the reports by the Clark Fox Policy Institute. Yes, we have an example.
That is a great example. And it's a great opportunity because the DSEC program will be ending soon. So if we start investing in the 0 to 3, then we can start moving beyond needing something like the desegregation program.
Yeah, so a couple of the other things, Atia, you did such a wonderful job addressing one or two of the points that have already come through. So thanks to Jennifer as well as Edward for their questions. One other thing that came through that caught our eye, there have been a number of great questions and just an incredible appreciation for folks' participation. So Joseph, who is a social worker from East Harlem, New York, welcome Joseph, asks, is actually building a lot on that local example, Atia, which brought this to my mind, thinking about specifically how local policies contribute to or propel racial injustice. He's also noting feeling a major shift between mayoral administrations in New York City, which St. Louis has also experienced in the not too distant past. So as policy practitioners, as policy researchers, how do we think about these issues from a hyper-local context? And how do we think about the long game as the policy decision makers will come and go, ebb and flow and change along the way?
Absolutely. Hyper-local means hyper-influential. And it means that you can navigate and try and experiment at a much quicker cycle. And also local politics can be tricky to navigate because the change cycle does happen more quickly. So I'm thinking hard about this because part of it is if you can get a coalition, and a coalition can help create a policy that sustains it beyond a politician.
Yeah.
So if you can use coalition building to help create a policy that works for many organizations, that affects multiple stakeholders, you can create a structure that supports a policy beyond the life cycle of a politician. And I think that's one strategy to consider.
Absolutely. And I think especially in New York, you kind of need that because boroughs are so different. Each community is so unique. But to bring it back to a social work competency, that is your competency 6. That is engaging individuals, families, groups, and organizations and communities. And so that is part of what we do in local government is we try to engage starting from the individual all the way up to the community in politics.
Yeah, and Joel, thank you both again so very much for the incredible presentation, the engaging discussion, for sharing your expertise, your experience, your passion. But we've switched now from questions coming in to just thanks in the Q&A. So acknowledging folks just writing in. With the time we have left, did you both just want to offer a closing thought just to bring us back together?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that I'm the mother of a beautiful, brilliant human being. We were just talking before this call about this prestigious scholarship he's been offered, about like the role he plays in our family. And he also happens to be a Black male. So, every day when he leaves the house and I leave the house, I have to come to a reckoning around the world we live in and the world I'm trying to create for him. And so I want people to use their imagination because we've been in a place that's deliberately created narrative and dehumanizing people in order to justify oppression and suppression and subrogation. And we need to be a fair and just nation. We need to change that. So I'm excited that racial equity is being talked about. That, there's a lot of pushback. Push back, keep pushing. Racial equity in general, we need to remedy 400 years of isms, right? To get us closer to the path that's justice and liberation. And, we're in the cycle of reckoning, we're in a truth-telling cycle. So when you have policymakers who are preoccupied with what teachers can talk to their students about, we're in a place of great opportunity, actually, because when we make policymakers feel that threatened by what happens at the local level, we need to push back. We need to talk about equity. We need to advocate, and we need to use our imaginations. I want you as policymakers, and you are, if you can vote If you can help shape policy, if you can get a ballot initiative, you are a policymaker. I need you to sign on to do that work so that all humans here in the United States can prosper and we're not hindered by any aspect of our identity.
I agree. And I think every challenge presents an opportunity. And the question is, what does that opportunity mean for you? And how will you become a part of the solution and part of the disruption of the problems that we're seeing? So we need you because you are the opportunity that we need to address a long-standing history of inequities. And to quote, the beloved Desmond Tutu, this is a system of Ubuntu. I am as we are. So we are what we want to be in this world. So come on, let's get to being active participants in the change that we want to see in this world.
Can we thank everybody here for celebrating Black history and Black futures?
Yes, Black futures.
And Jewel, thank you again. Students, your colleagues, the broader public interested in this topic are so fortunate to get to learn from and with you. And that'll conclude our session for today. Thanks again to all for their time, their engagement, their great questions, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody again soon at another open classroom just around the corner. So thanks all and see you next time.